At dawn on January 24, 1945, the frozen forests of eastern France were already shaking under the weight of war. In a dim command post dug into the snow, First Lieutenant Garland Merl stood hunched over a map table, listening to the thunder of German artillery tearing apart the tree line 400 yards ahead. He was only 25 years old, an intelligence officer whose bandages were still fresh beneath his uniform, wounds barely healed from the hospital bed he had left just 2 days earlier. Outside, the temperature hovered far below zero, and every blast sent showers of ice and splintered wood crashing down on the men in the trenches. Connor had not grown up dreaming of war. He was a tobacco farmer's son from rural Kentucky, 5 feet 6 inches tall and barely 120 pounds, a boy who never finished high school because the nearest classroom lay 15 miles from his family's land. Yet 4 years of war had carried him across continents and beaches, through 10 major campaigns and 4 amphibious landings, and left him wounded 7 times. Medals rested somewhere in his pack, but he never spoke of them. In the battalion, men whispered a simple truth. When everything went wrong, Connor went forward. That morning, everything was going wrong. Beyond the frozen fields lay the Colmar Pocket, the last stubborn wedge of German territory in France. 4 months, the enemy had clung to it, a stretch of forests and farms where French and American assaults had failed again and again. Now, as Hitler's final winter offensive collapsed elsewhere, the Germans here had nothing left to lose. 6 Tiger tanks and 600 infantry were moving toward 3rd Battalion's left flank, determined to tear open the American line. Inside the command post, a runner burst in, breathless, shouting that the tanks were coming. The battalion commander bent over the map, his face tight with fear. There were no American tanks nearby, no destroyers, no heavy weapons to stop what was coming. Only artillery could do it, but the forward observers were dead, their posts smashed by the opening barrage. Someone had to go forward and see the enemy. Connor picked up a field telephone and a spool of wire. He looked once at the commander, said nothing, and stepped out into the snow. 400 yards of open ground lay between him and the front line. Snow crust cracked under his boots as he ran, the wire trailing behind like a lifeline. At 100 yards, German shells began to fall. 1 burst left, 1 right. The enemy had seen him. Trees exploded ahead, trunks splitting in showers of splinters. A blast behind him knocked him off balance, but he kept running, lungs burning, ears ringing, heart hammering in his chest. At the American foxholes he did not stop. He ran past stunned soldiers and kept going, straight toward the advancing Germans, until he dropped into a shallow ditch just beyond the line. It was barely deep enough to hide his body, barely deep enough to keep him alive. He cranked the handset. The line held. 3 miles away, American guns waited for his voice. When Connor lifted his head, he saw them, gray-coated infantry moving through the trees in disciplined rushes, and behind them, the Tigers. Massive shapes pushing through forest as if saplings were grass. 60-ton monsters, their guns already searching for targets. Connor began to speak calmly into the handset, calling the first coordinates. The opening shells fell too far back. He corrected them. The next salvo tore into the German ranks, shredding trees and men alike. Again and again he adjusted the fire, walking explosions through the advancing formations. The forest became a slaughterhouse of smoke and splinters and screaming steel. But the Tigers kept coming. Shells shattered tracks and jammed turrets, but 4 tanks still rolled forward, crushing through debris, firing into the foxholes. American soldiers died in bursts of fire, buried where they crouched. Connor watched the tanks turn toward him. The commanders had spotted the wire. They knew who was killing them. When the lead tanks closed within 150 yards, Connor did something no manual taught. He called artillery on his own position. The fire direction officer hesitated, asked him to confirm. Connor confirmed again. And again. Shells fell so close that the air crushed the breath from his lungs. Dirt and shrapnel rained into the ditch. Heat burned his face. The blast waves lifted his body from the frozen earth and slammed him back down. Yet he stayed, whispering corrections, dragging the barrage back and forth between himself and the enemy. German infantry crawled within yards of him. He dropped shells 10 yards out, 5 yards out, closer than anyone should survive. Officers vanished in fire. Squads disintegrated. Tanks stopped blind and burning, crews fleeing only to be cut down by rifle fire. For 3 hours he lay there, numb with cold, half-deaf, wounded again by fragments he barely felt, while German and American shells crashed around him in the same killing circle. A private crawled out to help him and was hit in the leg, but refused to leave. Together they watched and called fire and held the line. At last the last tiger stopped moving, blind and crippled. The German survivors pulled back, dragging their wounded, leaving their dead and shattered machines behind. Silence fell. Connor did not rise at once. He waited, watching the forest, making sure the enemy would not come again. When he finally stood, his legs barely obeyed him. Soldiers stared in disbelief at the lone lieutenant walking back through a moonscape of craters and twisted steel. The battalion had been saved. Weeks later, a general pinned a Distinguished Service Cross on his chest. The paperwork for the Medal of Honor moved too slowly. Connor was sent home, wounded and exhausted, and the war ended without his name in the headlines. He returned to Kentucky, married a young woman named Pauline, farmed the land, helped veterans, and never spoke of what he had done. His medals stayed hidden in a box in a closet. 50 years passed. Only near the end of his life did the truth surface, when another veteran opened that box and began a long fight to correct the record. Connor died before the decision came. But Pauline did not stop. In 2018, more than 70 years after that frozen morning, the White House finally called his name. The Medal of Honor was placed in her hands. The citation read aloud, "A young farmer's son who ran through fire, lay alone in a ditch, and stopped an army with a telephone and courage." And at last, the world learned what a quiet man from Kentucky had done when everything depended on one voice in the snow.